Finding home at the Pelican Inn. A later-in-life love at Pelican Inn romance. Written by Susanne. Please like and subscribe. Chapter 1. The Pelican Inn rose from the morning mist like something out of a watercolor painting, all soft edges and gentle light. Vivian Shaw pulled into the shell-lined drive and sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel. Yesterday morning, she'd been standing in the conference room of the Beaufort Maritime Museum, listening to the board chair explain, with practiced regret, that the restoration project had been indefinitely postponed due to funding concerns. Translation: the wealthy donor had changed his mind, and Vivian's carefully planned consultation on their historic captain's quarters exhibit was no longer needed. She should be furious. Should be calculating the lost income, the wasted time, the embarrassment of having to explain to colleagues why she was suddenly available again. Instead, she felt something closer to relief, which was almost more unsettling than anger would have been. The inn's wraparound porch beckoned with white wicker furniture and hanging baskets heavy with trailing petunias. Someone had restored this place with obvious care. The paint was fresh but historically accurate, the landscaping lush without being overdone. Vivian's trained eye automatically catalogued details. Period-appropriate shutters, original crown molding visible through the windows, gardens that balanced structure with natural growth. Professional habit, even when her profession felt increasingly uncertain. She gathered her purse and the leather portfolio that held sketches for a project that would never happen, then stepped into the salt-tinged air. She'd driven straight here from Beaufort, needing space to think and. The Pelican Inn had seemed like the perfect solution when she'd called yesterday evening. Close enough to the coast she'd already planned to visit, far enough from her real life to gain some perspective. The screen door opened before she could knock, revealing a woman about her own age with kind eyes and laugh lines that suggested she smiled often. "You must be Vivian Shaw," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Elise Oswald. We spoke on the phone yesterday about the room? Thank you for accommodating me on such short notice." Vivian shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the wedding ring that caught the morning light. "I know calling yesterday evening wasn't ideal. Happy to help. Though I have to admit, when you called, you sounded like you needed to get away from something." "More like I needed to figure out what I'm running toward," Vivian said with a rueful smile. "The museum project in Beaufort fell through rather spectacularly yesterday, and instead of driving straight back to Atlanta to sulk, I thought I might take some time to reassess." "Well, you've come to the right place for that." Elise gestured toward the interior. "Come on in. Jacob's just finishing up some work on the guest room plumbing, but everything should be ready in about an hour." The foyer took Vivian's breath away. Original heart pine floors gleamed beneath her feet, and an antique chandelier cast warm pools of light across cream-colored walls. Someone had chosen every element with exquisite care. The narrow console table that didn't overwhelm the space, the botanical prints that echoed the gardens outside, even the way fresh white hydrangeas had been arranged in a vintage ironstone pitcher. "This is stunning," Vivian said, and meant it. "Did you do the restoration yourself?" A shadow crossed Elise's face, there and gone so quickly Vivian might have imagined it. "My late brother started it. Jacob, my husband, and I finished what Travis began." She gestured toward the sitting room. "Can I get you some coffee? I was just about to start a fresh pot." "That would be wonderful." Vivian followed her through rooms that managed to feel both elegant and comfortable. Not an easy balance to achieve, but whoever had overseen this restoration understood the difference between museum perfect and lived-in beautiful. In the kitchen, afternoon light streamed through windows that framed a view of the Atlantic. Elise moved with the efficiency of someone who knew her space intimately, measuring coffee and filling the pot while keeping up a steady stream of conversation about the island's history, the inn's previous guests, the weather forecast for the week. Vivian found herself relaxing for the first time in days. Maybe even weeks. "So what sort of design work do you do?" Elise asked, setting out delicate china cups that were clearly meant for guests, not everyday use. "Historic preservation, mostly. Or I did." Vivian traced the rim of her cup, uncertain how to explain the sudden shift in her career. I spent 25 years building a firm that specialized in period-appropriate interiors for historic homes and museums. We were known for our attention to authenticity, our research capabilities. My business partner decided our approach was too old-fashioned for modern clients. She wanted to pivot toward what she called historic-inspired design, taking liberties with period accuracy for the sake of contemporary convenience. Vivian's voice remained steady, but her fingers tightened slightly on the cup. When I resisted, she bought out my share of the company. I'm sorry. That must have been difficult. Freeing, actually. Or at least that's what I keep telling myself. Vivian managed a smile. Which is why losing this museum project might be exactly what I needed. A sign that I should take some time to figure out what comes next. The sound of boots on the back porch interrupted them, followed by a man's voice calling, "Elise?" The upstairs bathroom's all set, but I need to grab. He stopped short when he saw Vivian, his expression shifting to the polite smile of someone meeting an unexpected guest. Jacob, this is Vivian Shaw. Vivian, my husband Jacob. Jacob Oswald was exactly what Vivian would have expected from a man who restored historic buildings. Capable hands, keen eyes that probably missed nothing, the kind of steady presence that suggested problems got solved rather than endlessly discussed. His handshake was firm but brief. Welcome to the Pelican Inn. Elise mentioned you might be staying longer than originally planned? If that's possible. I know you weren't expecting a long-term guest. Actually, this is perfect timing, Elise said, refilling coffee cups. We're heading into our quiet season. Most of our regulars won't start booking again until after Thanksgiving, so having someone here who appreciates what we've done with the place. Well, it would be our pleasure. Vivian felt something ease in her chest. I'd love that. And I promise to stay out of your way. Don't be ridiculous, Jacob said, but his tone was warm. This place is meant to be lived in, not just admired. Though I should warn you. You won't be our only long-term guest. Calvin Briggs is staying here while his rental gets some mold remediation. He keeps to himself mostly, but... The scrape of heavy boots on the front porch saved Jacob from having to finish that thought. Through the kitchen window, Vivian caught sight of a weathered man in a faded flannel shirt dragging what appeared to be a large cooler across the oyster shell path. His movements were economical but suggested someone who was comfortable with physical work, even if a slight limp hinted at old injuries. Perfect timing, Elise murmured, but there was affection in her voice. Calvin's probably bringing in his catch from this morning. He usually shares with Miss Doris. She's our unofficial island grandmother and the best baker in 3 counties. Vivian watched through the window as Calvin hefted the cooler with obvious effort, his jaw set in concentration. Everything about him suggested someone who had no patience for unnecessary conversation or social niceties. His hair was salt and pepper gray beneath a baseball cap that had seen better days, and several days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. He looked like the kind of man who would track sand through a freshly cleaned house and not understand why anyone might object. He seems. Vivian searched for a diplomatic way to phrase her observation. Grumpy? Jacob supplied with a grin. Yeah, that's Calvin. But he's good people. Just not much for small talk. The front door opened and closed with more force than strictly necessary, followed by the thud of boots being kicked off in the foyer. Calvin's voice carried back to the kitchen, gravelly and tired. Elise? Got some red snapper for Miss Doris if she wants it. And the upstairs shower's dripping again. I'll look at it later, Jacob called back, but Calvin was already moving through the house, his footsteps heavy on the old floors. Vivian found herself holding her breath as he appeared in the kitchen doorway, cooler in hand. Up close, he was more imposing than she'd expected. Not particularly tall, but solid in the way of men who worked with their hands. His hazel eyes swept the room, taking in her presence with the kind of assessing look that suggested he was already calculating how much her being here might disrupt his routine. Calvin, I'd like you to meet Vivian Shaw, Elise said smoothly. She's going to be staying with us for a while. Calvin set the cooler down with a thud that made Vivian's coffee cup rattle against its saucer. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his cap in what might have been politeness or might have been dismissal. "Mr. Briggs." Vivian kept her voice pleasantly neutral, though something about his obvious reluctance to engage stirred her own competitive instincts. "I understand you're between places as well." "Something like that." His gaze flicked over her linen pants and pearl earrings with the kind of quick assessment that left her feeling simultaneously overdressed and defensive. "You here on vacation?" "Working." "Or I was supposed to be." She lifted her chin slightly. "Design consultation that fell through." "Shame." But his tone suggested he couldn't care less about her professional disappointments. He turned to Elise. "I'll clean the fish on the back porch, get them to Miss Doris before they sit too long in this heat." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of salt water and the impression that he'd sized her up and found her wanting. "Don't take it personally," Jacob said, reading her expression. "Calvin's been dealing with a lot lately. The hurricane that hit 2 years ago took his house, and he's been sort of drifting ever since." "I see." Vivian smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her pants, annoyed with herself for caring what a grumpy fisherman thought of her. "Well, I'm sure we'll manage to coexist peacefully." "I'm sure you will," Elise said, but something in her tone suggested she found the idea of Vivian and Calvin coexisting more entertaining than peaceful. Through the window, Vivian watched Calvin set up what was clearly a practiced routine for cleaning fish, his movements efficient and sure. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if this was one of the few times he found any peace. She wondered what it would be like to feel that settled in your own skin, that certain of your place in the world. Even before the buyout, even when her career was thriving, she'd always felt like she was performing some version of herself rather than simply being. Maybe that's what she needed to figure out during her unexpected stay at the Pelican Inn. Not what came next professionally, but who she was when she wasn't trying to be anyone in particular. Though if she was going to do that, she'd have to find a way to share the space with a man who clearly had no interest in polite conversation or social niceties. How hard could it be? Chapter 2. Calvin Briggs had been looking forward to breakfast at the Pelican Inn for exactly one reason: peace and quiet. Miss Doris made coffee strong enough to wake the dead and biscuits that could convince a man there might actually be a heaven, but more importantly, she understood that some people needed to start their day without a lot of chatter. That plan fell apart the moment he walked into the dining room and found it already occupied. The fancy Atlanta decorator from yesterday was sitting at the table by the window, her steel blue eyes bright with morning light and a delicate china cup cradled in her manicured hands. She'd probably never drunk coffee from anything that wasn't bone china in her life. "Morning, Calvin," Miss Doris called from the kitchen doorway, and he could hear the amusement in her voice. "Coffee's fresh, and I've got biscuits coming out of the oven in 5 minutes." Calvin grunted his thanks and headed for the sideboard where Miss Doris had set up the coffee service. If he was going to endure polite breakfast conversation, he'd need more caffeine than his single cup upstairs had provided. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs," Vivian said, her voice carefully pleasant. "I hope you don't mind sharing the dining room." Elise said guests usually eat whenever they're ready. "It's fine." He poured coffee into one of the sturdy white mugs, the kind that could survive being dropped once or twice. Through the window, he could see his boat bobbing at the dock, waiting for him to check the engine before this afternoon's charter. Miss Doris bustled in with a plate of golden biscuits and a crock of butter, setting them on the table between the two guests. "Vivian was just telling me about her work with historic preservation," she said, clearly determined to drag him into conversation. "Sounds like she's done some fascinating projects." Calvin took a long sip of coffee, letting the bitter heat clear his head. "I'm sure. The work here at the inn is really beautiful," Vivian said, and something in her tone suggested she was trying to bridge whatever gap his obvious reluctance had created. "The restoration is so thoughtfully done. Someone really understood the original character of the building." "Takes time to do it right," Calvin said. "Can't rush good work." "No, you can't." She seemed to consider this, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I imagine it must have been satisfying to be part of bringing this place back to life." Calvin reached for a biscuit, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. He hadn't meant to invite personal discussion. Life's difficult. You deal with it or you don't. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw Miss Doris's eyebrows rise in warning. But something about Vivian's carefully composed expression, the way she sat there looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread, rubbed him wrong. Some people lost everything to hurricanes and heart attacks. Others just got tired of their high-paying jobs and called it a crisis. You're absolutely right, Vivian said, and her voice was steady but cooler now. Sometimes dealing with it means knowing when to step back and reassess. Miss Doris cleared her throat. Calvin, didn't you mention you were taking the Miss Behaven out this afternoon? I thought Vivian might enjoy seeing the island from the water sometime. Paying charter today, Calvin said quickly. Doctor from Columbia and his buddies. They want to try their luck at some red drum. Of course. Vivian's smile didn't waver, but something in her posture suggested she was already mentally backing away from the conversation. Well, I should let you finish your breakfast in peace. Thank you for the biscuits, Miss Doris. They're wonderful. She rose with the kind of fluid grace that made Calvin think of expensive ballet performances, gathering her small purse and smoothing her linen pants in one seamless motion. Even her way of moving seemed calculated, like she was always performing for an invisible audience. Vivian, Miss Doris said as she reached the doorway. You should walk down to the point this morning. The view from there is something special, and the tide pools are worth seeing. I'll do that. Thank you. And then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender and the uncomfortable feeling that Calvin had just behaved like an ass. Miss Doris waited exactly 30 seconds before fixing him with a look that could have stripped barnacles off his boat hull. Well, that was gracious of you. Calvin reached for another biscuit, avoiding her eyes. Just being honest. Some of us don't get to run away when life gets complicated. Run away? Miss Doris's voice rose an octave. Calvin Briggs, that woman just had her business partnership dissolved, lost her professional identity, and probably a good chunk of her financial security. She's starting over at 58. How exactly is that running away? She's got options most people don't. So do you. Miss Doris began clearing Vivian's place setting with sharp, efficient movements. When was the last time you slept in your own bed? When was the last time you had a place that was actually yours? The question hit harder than he'd expected. Calvin stared into his coffee, seeing his reflection wavering in the dark surface. 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days since the hurricane had taken his house. Since he'd stopped pretending he was going to rebuild and started moving from one temporary place to another like driftwood following the tide. That's different. Is it? Or are you just as scared as she is, but too stubborn to admit it? Calvin pushed back from the table, the chair leg scraping against polished wood. I should get going. Need to prep the boat before the charter arrives. Calvin. Miss Doris's voice was gentler now. That woman isn't your enemy. And she's not Marlene. The name hit him like a slap. Marlene, who'd left him 12 years ago because she was tired of living with a man who had no ambition beyond his next fishing trip. Marlene, who'd found someone with a corner office and a 5-year plan and never looked back. Never said she was. Didn't have to. It's written all over your face. Miss Doris began stacking plates with the kind of brisk efficiency that suggested she had more to say but was choosing not to. Just remember, Calvin, judging people by their appearance tells you more about yourself than it does about them. Calvin headed for the French doors that led to the back porch, but paused with his hand on the handle. She'll be gone in a week. 2 at most. Fancy decorator like that? Island life will get old fast. Maybe. Or maybe she'll surprise you. He stepped onto the porch, letting the door close behind him with a soft click. The morning air was already thick with humidity, promising another scorching day, and the salt breeze carried the familiar sounds of gulls and lapping waves. This was his world. Simple things that made sense. Not complicated women with sad eyes and pearl earrings who talked about needing space to think. His boots thudded against the wooden steps as he made his way down to the dock. The Miss Behaven was waiting for him, her hull gleaming white in the morning sun. 26 feet of center console that he'd bought used and restored himself, every inch of her as familiar as his own reflection. He'd just started checking the engine oil when movement on the beach caught his eye. Vivian was walking along the waterline, her shoes in one hand and her other arm wrapped around her waist like she was holding herself together. From this distance, without the careful posture and practiced smile, she looked smaller somehow. Fragile in a way that had nothing to do with her size and everything to do with the set of her shoulders. She'd stopped near the point where the island curved toward the lighthouse, standing perfectly still as waves washed over her bare feet. Even from here, Calvin could see the way she was staring out at the horizon, as if she was looking for something that might not be there. The protective instinct rolled over him like a rogue wave. Sudden, unexpected, and completely unwelcome. He didn't want to feel sorry for some fancy Atlanta decorator who probably spent more on a single pair of shoes than he made in a week. Didn't want to notice the way the morning light caught the auburn threads in her hair, or wonder what had put that lost look in her eyes. But he was noticing. And despite every rational thought in his head, part of him wanted to walk down that beach and ask if she was all right. Which was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten him in trouble before. Calvin turned his attention back to the engine, forcing himself to focus on the familiar routine of checking fluid levels and testing connections. The Miss Behaven needed him in ways that were clear and uncomplicated. She required maintenance and attention and respect for the water, but she didn't require him to figure out emotional puzzles or navigate conversations loaded with subtext. When he looked up again, Vivian was gone. Just empty beach and rolling waves, as if she'd never been there at all. But the protective feeling lingered, settled somewhere in his chest like an anchor he couldn't quite pull free. And that, Calvin thought grimly, was going to be a problem. Chapter 3. The sunroom at the Pelican Inn was perfect for working with its comfortable seating and good natural light. Vivian had claimed the wicker settee by the east windows, spreading her supplies across the glass-topped coffee table. Her sketchpad showed preliminary designs for a hypothetical historic in renovation, just ideas that had been percolating since she'd arrived. She was refining the lines of a wraparound porch detail when heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Calvin Briggs appeared in the doorway, a worn leather portfolio under one arm and what looked like maritime charts rolled up in his other hand. He stopped short when he saw her, his expression shifting from expectant to annoyed in the space of a heartbeat. He muttered something under his breath. "I'm sorry?" Vivian looked up from her sketch, pencil suspended over the paper. "Did you need something?" "Peace and quiet." He gestured with the charts. "Need to check some tide tables and weather patterns for next week's charters." Elise said the sunroom was available for guests to use. "It is available. For both of us." Vivian set her pencil down carefully, recognizing the stubborn set to his jaw. "The room is certainly large enough to share." Calvin's gaze swept over her art supplies spread across the coffee table, then to the throw pillows she'd automatically arranged into a more pleasing configuration when she'd first sat down. His frown deepened. "Fine." He dropped into the armchair across from her with more force than necessary, the old wicker creaking in protest. "Just try to keep it down." "Keep what down?" Vivian asked, but he was already unrolling his charts, clearly done with conversation. For the next 10 minutes, they worked in tense silence. The temperature in the room was stifling. Vivian rose and padded over to the old-fashioned thermostat. The dial was set somewhere in the middle range. No wonder she felt overheated. She turned it down toward the cooler end, and within moments warm air began flowing from the vents. "Congratulations," Calvin said without looking up. "You just turned on the heat." She stared at the thermostat in confusion, then noticed the small toggle switch above the dial. "Oh. There's a switch." "Yep. Heat or cool?" "You turned it down, but it's still heat." She caught the hint of amusement in his tone. "Still blowing warm air." She flipped the switch and adjusted the dial again, but warm air continued to pour from the vents. "How long before it changes over?" "Few minutes." System has to cycle through. Calvin looked up, taking in her flustered expression. Guess we're stuck with it. Vivian returned to her seat, face burning. The room grew noticeably warmer. She shifted on the settee, trying to find a comfortable position. The pencil felt slippery in her damp fingers, and her carefully pinned hair was coming loose. When she shifted again, Calvin was watching her with obvious disapproval. Problem? He asked. It's quite warm. You're the one who turned up the heat. The throw pillows behind her back felt lumpy and poorly arranged. Without thinking, she reached behind her to adjust them. What are you doing now? Calvin's voice was sharp. Just. She fluffed one of the pillows. These weren't arranged very well. They were fine. They were lumpy. She moved to the second pillow, positioning it more strategically. There's no proper support for. For the love of, Calvin slammed his pencil down. Can you please stop rearranging everything for 5 minutes? The outburst made Vivian freeze, pillow still in hand. I was trying to get comfortable. You've been fidgeting and moving things around since you turned this place into a sauna. First the thermostat, now the furniture. What's next? Going to rearrange my charts? I'm not rearranging furniture. I'm adjusting a pillow. You've been adjusting things since I walked into this room. Your pencils, your papers, the pillows, the thermostat. The thermostat was an accident. Was it? Or do you just can't help yourself when things aren't exactly the way you think they should be? The accusation hit closer to home than Vivian cared to admit. She clutched the pillow against her chest, suddenly aware of how she must look with her hair escaping its pins, face flushed from the heat, frantically rearranging throw pillows like some sort of compulsive decorator. You're right, she said quietly. I can't help myself. It's like a disease. The unexpected honesty seemed to deflate Calvin's anger. He blinked, clearly having expected her to argue back. A disease? Chronic beautification syndrome. Terminal case. Vivian held up the pillow like evidence in her own trial. I once rearranged the magazines in my dentist's waiting room. Twice. During the same appointment. Calvin stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, despite his obvious effort to maintain his scowl, the corner of his mouth twitched. Twice? They had them organized by date instead of size and color coordination. It was chaos. Vivian caught herself gesturing with the pillow and forced her hand still. My hygienist said I was the only patient who'd ever asked if I could just tidy up a bit while waiting for my cleaning. That's. Calvin's fight against a smile was clearly failing. That's actually disturbing. I prefer thorough. And then he laughed. It was a rusty sound, as if he was out of practice, but genuine. The harsh lines around his eyes softened, and for a moment Vivian caught a glimpse of what he might have been like before life wore him down. Well, he said, clearing his throat as the laughter faded. I should get back to these charts. Of course. But Vivian found herself reluctant to end the moment. Are those really tide charts? Calvin nodded, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. Need to check the best times for fishing next week. Tides, weather patterns, water temperature. Fish are picky about their conditions. I had no idea there was so much science involved. Most people don't. He showed her one of the charts. If you want to find fish consistently, you need to understand what makes them move, where they feed, when they're most active. Like being a detective, in a way. Never thought of it like that, but. He paused, studying her face. Yeah, I suppose it is. So what do the charts tell you about next week? Tuesday and Wednesday look promising. New moon means darker water, and the tides will be just right for redfish. He pointed to his neat handwriting. Doctor from Colombia specifically requested red drum, so I want to deliver. Sounds like you take your reputation seriously. In this business, reputation is everything. He glanced at her sketchpad. What about you? What were you working on? Design ideas for historic and renovations. After his comments about her compulsive beautifying, she felt almost embarrassed. Just playing around. Can I see? She opened her sketchpad hesitantly. Calvin studied the rough sketches for a long moment. That's really thoughtful. You can see how someone could actually live in a place like this. Thank you. It's nothing fancy. Nothing fancy? Lady, I can barely draw a straight line with a ruler. This is talent. They worked in comfortable silence for the next 20 minutes. Eventually, Calvin began gathering his papers. Getting somewhere to be? Vivian asked. Need to prep the boat for this afternoon's charter. He paused. Thanks for listening. Most people's eyes glaze over when I start talking about tides and weather patterns. Why wouldn't I? It's fascinating work. Most people think fishing is just an excuse to drink beer and avoid responsibility. Most people don't understand what real expertise looks like. He studied her face, then nodded before heading for the door. See you around, I guess. Mr. Briggs? She called as he reached the threshold. For what it's worth, I think what you do is quite impressive. All that planning and preparation, it's like being fluent in a language most people never even know exists. His surprised expression lingered before he nodded and disappeared down the hall. Vivian listened to his footsteps fade away, then gathered her own supplies. She was tucking her pencils back into their case when she noticed something on the floor near where Calvin's chair had been. A small piece of paper, worn and creased as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. She picked it up and found herself looking at a faded photograph of a small house. Nothing fancy, just a simple coastal cottage with weathered shingles and a modest front porch. Someone had loved this place once. She could tell by the way the garden had been carefully tended, the way the porch swing hung at just the right angle. It must have fallen from Calvin's portfolio when he'd gathered his things. Vivian turned the photograph over, but there was nothing written on the back. No date, no names, no clues about why a gruff fisherman would carry around a picture of a modest little house. But something about the way the paper was worn from handling told her it was important to him. She should return it, of course. Catch up with him on his way to the dock and hand it back with some casual comment about him dropping it. Instead, she found herself studying the image more closely. The house had good bones, solid construction, well-proportioned windows, a roofline that suggested the builder had understood both function and beauty. With some restoration work, it could be lovely again. Before she could second-guess herself, Vivian slipped the photograph between the pages of her sketchbook. To keep it safe until she found the right moment to return it. Chapter 4. Calvin hadn't meant to watch. He'd come back from working on the Misbehavin' with every intention of grabbing a soda from the kitchen and heading straight to his room. The charter had gone well, 3 red drum and a couple of decent-sized trout for the doctor from Columbia, and he was looking forward to a quiet evening reviewing weather reports for the rest of the week. But as he approached the inn's back entrance, voices from the front parlor caught his attention. Through the window, he could see Vivian kneeling on the hardwood floor, surrounded by stacks of books while Miss Doris sorted through another box. No, dear, the local histories should go on the middle shelf, Miss Doris was saying, handing Vivian a volume. I level for the guests who actually want to learn something about the island. Good thinking, Vivian said, sliding it into place. Her linen pants would probably never recover from kneeling on the floor, but she didn't seem to care. Perfect. Now, those romance novels can go on the bottom shelf. Nothing wrong with a little escapism, but let's not advertise it. Calvin found himself pausing on the porch steps. He'd expected Vivian to treat this kind of work as beneath her. She seemed like someone who would delegate to the staff while she supervised from a distance. Instead, Vivian was doing the actual organizing, laughing at Miss Doris's commentary about those ridiculous covers with the shirtless pirates. What about this one? Vivian held up a thick volume that looked like it had seen better days. Some kind of local guide from the 1950s? Oh, that old thing. Belonged to my late husband. It's a fishing guide. He swore by those tide tables, though half the landmarks mentioned in there don't exist anymore. Miss Doris's voice softened. I suppose it belongs with the local history books, but it seems a shame to just stick it on a shelf. May I? Vivian opened the book carefully, handling the worn pages with obvious respect. These illustrations are beautiful. Hand-drawn maps of the fishing grounds, notes in the margins, this is a treasure. Calvin watched as she turned the pages with the kind of reverence usually reserved for museum pieces. Most people would have seen an old fishing guide and dismissed it as outdated. Vivian was treating it like the historical document it actually was. You know what this needs, she said suddenly. A display case. Open to one of these gorgeous maps, with a little placard explaining its significance to the island's fishing heritage. Guests would love to see something so authentic. Miss Doris beamed. What a wonderful idea. Calvin would probably know which map to feature. He's our resident expert on local fishing grounds. At the mention of his name, Calvin stepped back from the window. But not before he caught Vivian's response. He really seems to know what he's doing. The way he talked about reading the tides and weather patterns. There's real expertise there. Calvin felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. When was the last time someone had called him an expert at anything? Marlene had always made his knowledge of fishing grounds sound like an obsession with trivial details. But Vivian had used the word expertise like she meant it. He made his way quietly to the kitchen, grabbed his drink, and was halfway up the stairs when he heard footsteps in the hall below. Calvin? Is that you? Miss Doris's voice carried up the stairwell, leaving him no choice but to turn around. Evening, Miss D. Perfect timing. Come tell Vivian which of those old fishing maps would be best for display. Calvin descended the stairs reluctantly, soda still in hand. In the parlor, Vivian was sitting cross-legged on the floor, the fishing guide open in her lap. She'd pinned her hair back while working, and a few loose strands framed her face. The careful polish she usually wore had been replaced by something more natural, more approachable. Miss Doris mentioned you might have thoughts about this, she said, holding up the book. These maps are incredible. Calvin set his beer on the side table and crouched down beside her, trying to ignore the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her everywhere. The fishing guide was indeed a treasure. He'd seen copies of similar books in maritime museums that weren't half as well preserved. This one, he said, pointing to a detailed chart of the waters around the south end of the island. Shows the old oyster beds before the hurricane of '67 wiped them out. And see these depth markings? Hand calculated, probably took months to chart properly. It's beautiful work, Vivian said softly. You can see the care that went into it. My father helped with some of these surveys. Used to tell stories about dropping weighted lines every 50 yards, marking depths on grid paper by lamplight. Calvin traced one of the depth lines with his finger. All done with compass and sextant. No GPS, no fish finders. Just knowledge passed down through generations. That's exactly the kind of story guests would love to hear, Vivian said, her eyes bright with interest. The human connection to the place, the skill and dedication it took to create something like this. Calvin glanced up at Miss Doris, who was watching them with obvious satisfaction. You really think people would care about old fishing charts? Are you kidding? Vivian carefully turned the page to reveal another detailed map. This is living history. The kind of authentic experience people travel hundreds of miles to find. They spent the next 20 minutes going through the guide, with Calvin explaining the significance of various landmarks and Vivian asking thoughtful questions about fishing techniques and seasonal patterns. It wasn't until Miss Doris announced she was heading home that Calvin realized how easily the conversation had flowed. I'll finish organizing these tomorrow, Vivian said, closing the fishing guide carefully. Thank you for the history lesson. Wasn't a lesson. Just old stories. The best kind, she said, rising gracefully from the floor and smoothing her wrinkled pants. Good night, Miss Doris. Thank you for letting me help. After Miss Doris left, an awkward silence settled over the parlor. Calvin picked up one of the book boxes, aware of Vivian moving around the room, straightening cushions and adjusting the angle of a table lamp. She really couldn't help herself. You don't have to do that, he said. Do what? Rearrange things. The room was fine before. Vivian paused with her hand on a throw pillow, then deliberately fluffed it and set it back at a slightly different angle. Define fine. Functional. Comfortable. Not fussy. Ah. She moved to the next pillow, her movements precise and practiced. And here I thought we were going for welcoming and attractive. Calvin watched her work, genuinely puzzled. But why does it matter how the pillows sit? People are just going to mess them up anyway. That's like asking why it matters if you tune a guitar when it's just going to go out of tune later. Vivian stepped back to assess her work, head tilted slightly. Beauty isn't permanent, but that doesn't make it pointless. A guitar serves a purpose. Music. What purpose does a perfect pillow serve? Comfort. Visual harmony. The feeling that someone cares enough about your experience to make it pleasant. She turned to face him, and there was something almost defensive in her posture. What's wrong with wanting things to be beautiful? Calvin set down the box of books, considering her question. Nothing wrong with it, I guess. Just seems like a lot of effort for something most people don't even notice. You noticed. The simple statement caught him off guard. She was right. He had noticed. Had been noticing since the first day she'd arrived, the way she unconsciously improved every space she entered. Hard not to notice when someone's constantly moving things around, he said, but his tone lacked its usual edge. Vivian's smile was slight but genuine. My ex-husband used to say I could rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic and somehow make the whole disaster look more appealing. Ex-husband, huh? Amicable divorce. We wanted different things. She picked up another book box, proving she was stronger than she looked. He preferred everything exactly as it was. I preferred everything exactly as it could be. Calvin hefted the remaining box, following her toward the storage closet. And now? Now I'm figuring out the difference between improving something and changing it because I can't sit still. She paused at the closet door, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Your boat, the Misbehavin'. Did you restore her yourself? The change of subject surprised him. Some. Bought her used, fixed what needed fixing. Why that boat? There must have been others available. Calvin thought about it as they stacked the boxes in the closet. Why had he chosen the Misbehavin'? She'd been overpriced and undermaintained, with a hull that needed work and an engine that required more faith than logic. Good bones, he said finally. Could see what she used to be, what she could be again with the right attention. Vivian's smile was soft, understanding. Exactly. They finished storing the boxes in comfortable silence. As they walked back through the parlor, Calvin noticed how the small changes Vivian had made, the angled lamp, the fluffed pillows, the careful arrangement of books on the side table, somehow made the whole room feel more welcoming. Like someone actually lived there instead of just passing through. The pillow thing still doesn't make sense to me, he said as they reached the foot of the stairs. Vivian paused, one hand on the banister, and rolled her eyes. But she was smiling when she did it, and Calvin found himself studying the way the expression transformed her face. Made her look younger, less guarded. Good night, Calvin, she said softly. Night. He watched her climb the stairs, noting the straight line of her shoulders, the graceful way she moved even when she was tired. At the top of the stairs, she paused and looked back. Thank you for the stories about the fishing charts. I meant what I said. It's living history. Chapter 5. Vivian hadn't planned on joining the heritage walking tour. She'd simply been sketching on the inn's front porch when a small group of tourists gathered near the historical marker at the end of the drive, consulting maps and checking their watches with the focused determination of people following an itinerary. Island Heritage Walking Tour starts here at 10, one of them called to her. You're welcome to join if you'd like. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to learn more about Palmar Island's history. Research that might prove useful for her design work, she told herself. Certainly not procrastination, and definitely not an excuse to avoid thinking about the increasingly frequent emails from clients asking when she planned to return to Atlanta. The group was small. 2 couples from Charleston, a retired teacher from Columbia, and herself. They were expecting their guide momentarily, though no one seemed entirely sure who that would be. The regular guide called in sick, explained Margaret, the teacher. But the visitor center assured us they'd found a replacement. Vivian was examining the historical marker, a bronze plaque describing the island's role in the Civil War, when familiar footsteps crunched on the oyster shell path behind her. "Sorry I'm late," Calvin's voice said. "Rick asked me to fill in." Vivian turned, surprised to see him approaching the group with a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He'd traded his usual flannel for a collared shirt, though he still wore his weathered baseball cap and work boots. The transformation was subtle but somehow made him look more approachable. "Calvin Briggs," he said to the group, his tone more formal than she was used to hearing. "I'll be your guide this morning." "Wonderful," said one of the Charleston couples. "We're particularly interested in the architectural history of the island." Calvin's gaze found Vivian's, and something that might have been amusement flickered in his expression. "Then you'll want to pay attention to our first stop." The next hour revealed a side of Calvin that Vivian hadn't expected. As they walked the tree-lined streets of the island's historic district, he proved to be a wealth of knowledge about everything from architectural details to local legends. He could identify the age of a house by its window style, explain why certain buildings had survived multiple hurricanes while others hadn't, and tell stories about the families who'd built and inhabited these homes across generations. "This cottage dates to the 1870s, he said, stopping in front of a small house with elaborate gingerbread trim. "Notice the raised foundation. That's not just for flood protection. The original builder was from New Orleans, and he designed it to catch the ocean breezes for natural cooling." Vivian found herself studying the house with new eyes, seeing how the architectural choices reflected both practical needs and aesthetic preferences. The way Calvin explained it made perfect sense. Form following function, but with attention to beauty. "The trim work is all original," Calvin continued, pointing to the delicate wooden details. "Hand-carved by a ship's carpenter who settled here after the war. You can see his signature rope motif if you look closely at the corner brackets." "How do you know all this?" asked Margaret, clearly impressed. Calvin's expression grew slightly uncomfortable, as if he'd revealed more than he'd intended. "Growing up here, you pick things up." But Vivian suspected there was more to it than that. The depth of his knowledge, the way he could read architectural clues like tide charts, wasn't casual observation. This was someone who'd made a study of the island's history. At their next stop, the old island church with its distinctive bell tower, Calvin told the story of how the building had served multiple purposes over the decades: church, school, hurricane shelter, and community meeting hall. During Hurricane Hazel in 1954, half the island took refuge here, he said, patting the thick tabby walls. "These walls are 2 feet thick, made from oyster shell concrete. The old builders knew what they were doing." "Have you lived through many hurricanes?" asked one of the Charleston visitors. Calvin's jaw tightened slightly. "A few. Most recent was Hurricane Isabel, 2 years ago. That one was significant." Vivian caught the careful way he phrased it, the pause before choosing his words. She thought about what Jacob had mentioned about Calvin losing his house, and suddenly understood why this particular topic might be difficult for him. The tour continued through the island's small commercial district, past the old post office building and the renovated general store that now served as a gift shop. Calvin's commentary was always informative, sometimes amusing, and occasionally surprisingly personal. "My great-grandfather ran a fishing operation out of that building," he said, pointing to a weathered structure near the harbor. "Back when the shrimp boats worked these waters regularly. Now it's storage for the marina, but you can still see the old icehouse foundation if you know where to look." As they walked, Vivian noticed how other islanders greeted Calvin. Someone working in their garden waved. A friendly call from a shopkeeper. This was clearly someone who belonged here, who was woven into the fabric of the community in ways that went far deeper than just knowing historical facts. The tour concluded at the island's old pier, where weathered pilings stretched into the harbor and pelicans perched like sentinels watching the water. Calvin explained how this had once been the main shipping point for the island's agricultural products, cotton, rice, and later, seafood. The original pier was twice as long, he said, pointing to where the structure ended. Hurricane Hazel took the outer section in 1954, and they never rebuilt it. What's left serves the fishing boats and pleasure craft just fine. Most of the group was ready to head back into town for lunch, gathering near the parking area and comparing notes about what they'd seen. But Vivian found herself drawn to the end of the pier, where a weathered bench offered a peaceful view of the harbor. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" she asked Calvin as the others began to disperse. "It's such a lovely view." "Of course not. I need to return Rick's materials to the visitor center anyway, but there's no rush." Calvin shouldered his satchel and followed her onto the pier. The bench was sun-warmed and perfectly positioned to watch boats moving in and out of the harbor. Vivian settled onto it gratefully, realizing how much walking they'd done over the past hour. Calvin remained standing, leaning against the pier railing with his arms crossed. "Thank you for such an informative tour," she said. "I knew the island had a lot of history, but there was a lot I didn't pick up on. Most people don't. They come for the beaches and the fishing, maybe a little shopping. The history's just background. Not to you, though." Calvin's expression grew thoughtful as he watched a pelican dive for fish near the pilings. "Guess when you grow up somewhere, you pay attention to the stories. My grandfather used to bring me down here when I was a kid, tell me about the old days when the steamships came through regularly. Made it all seem more real, somehow." "You have a gift for making it real for others too," Vivian said, then paused as something from the harbor caught her eye. Through a gap between the buildings, she could see a small coastal cottage with weathered shingles and a modest front porch. Her breath caught. She'd seen that house before, in the photograph tucked between the pages of her sketchbook. "That's my house," Calvin said quietly, following her gaze. "Was my house." The simple building looked exactly like the worn photograph she'd found. The same weathered shingles, the same modest porch where someone had once hung a swing. Now she understood why the picture had been handled so much, why it was so important to him. He nodded toward the cottage. "Bought it about 15 years ago. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Spent weekends fixing it up, making it feel like home." His hands tightened on the railing. "Hurricane Isabel took it all." Vivian felt her heart clench. "Oh, Calvin. I'm so sorry." "Insurance covered some of the damage, but not the memories." Calvin's smile was rueful. "Sounds sentimental, I know. It sounds human." Vivian turned to face him fully. "What did you do after?" "Moved onto the boat for a while. Then various rentals, temporary places. Been at the inn for 3 months now while they deal with mold issues at my current rental." He shrugged, as if this transient existence was perfectly normal. "It's easier than rebuilding." "Easier, maybe. But is it better?" Calvin finally looked at her, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression before he shuttered it away. "Rebuilding requires believing you deserve a permanent place somewhere. That it's worth the investment. And that the next storm won't take it." The words hung between them, loaded with more meaning than simple logistics. Vivian understood, suddenly, why Calvin seemed so guarded, so resistant to connection. He'd learned not to count on anything lasting. "For what it's worth," she said carefully, "I think you deserve whatever kind of home makes you happy. Even if I don't know what that looks like anymore? Especially then." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the water change color as clouds moved across the sun. The harbor was busy with afternoon boat traffic. Fishing vessels were returning from morning charters, pleasure boats heading out for sunset cruises. "I should get these materials back to Rick," Calvin said eventually, but he made no move to leave the pier. "Thank you for sharing all that history today. And for this." Vivian gestured toward the peaceful harbor scene, but meant the conversation as well. "Thank you for listening. Most people don't really want to hear island stories." "I'm not most people." Calvin's smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes. No, you're definitely not. As they walked back toward the parking area, Calvin shouldered his satchel. I was thinking of grabbing some coffee, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. The roasted bean is just down the road if you'd like to join me. The invitation surprised her. This was the same man who'd seemed annoyed by her very presence just days ago, and now he was voluntarily extending their time together. I'd like that, she said. Calvin's expression relaxed. Good. Fair warning though. It's not fancy. Just good coffee and decent conversation. Sounds perfect. As they walked toward the coffee shop, Vivian found herself reassessing everything she'd thought she knew about Calvin Briggs. The gruff fisherman was still there, but underneath was someone far more complex. He was a man who'd lost more than a house to Hurricane Isabel, who carried the island's history in his memory like precious cargo, who was slowly learning to trust again. And despite all her own uncertainty about the future, Vivian realized she wanted to be someone he could trust. Chapter 6. Calvin told himself it wasn't a date. He'd been very clear about that when he'd mentioned it over coffee yesterday afternoon. Just a chance to show Vivian the island from the water, since she'd seemed so interested in the history and architecture during the walking tour. A practical demonstration of why the early settlers had chosen this particular spot, how the harbor protected fishing boats from the worst weather, that sort of thing. Educational and informative. Definitely not a date. So why was he standing on the Miss Behaven's deck at 5:30 in the evening, checking the engine for the third time and wondering if he should have brought cushions for the bench seats? The boat was in good shape. She always was. Calvin took better care of the Miss Behaven than he did of himself most days. But as he heard footsteps on the dock behind him, he found himself seeing the 26-foot center console through Vivian's eyes. The practical white hull, the basic fishing equipment, the cooler that still smelled faintly of yesterday's catch despite his scrubbing. Not exactly elegant. Right on time, he called, trying to keep his voice casual as he looked up. Vivian was walking down the dock wearing white jeans and a soft blue sweater that somehow managed to look both practical and polished. She'd pulled her hair back in a low ponytail, and the late afternoon light caught the auburn highlights he'd been trying not to notice. I brought a jacket, she said, holding up a light windbreaker. Wasn't sure how cool it gets on the water. Good thinking. Can get chilly once the sun starts going down. Calvin offered his hand to help her aboard, trying to ignore the way her fingers felt in his. Warm and soft, with none of the calluses that marked his own hands. Watch your step. Deck can be slippery. She settled onto the bench seat across from the helm while Calvin started the engine. The familiar rumble calmed his nerves slightly. This was his domain, the one place where he never doubted what he was doing. Cast off that stern line for me, he asked, pointing to the rope securing the back of the boat. Vivian moved with surprising confidence, handling the line like someone who'd been around boats before. Like this? Perfect. Calvin backed them out of the slip with practiced ease, then turned the bow toward the harbor mouth. Ever been out on the water much? Some. My ex-husband had a sailboat. Nothing like this, though. She looked around the cockpit with obvious interest. This feels much more purposeful. Calvin couldn't help but smile. That's because she is. Miss Behaven was built for fishing, not cocktail parties. I like that. Form following function. As they cleared the no-wake zone and Calvin pushed the throttle forward, the boat rose onto plane with a satisfying surge of power. Vivian gripped the seat as they picked up speed, but she was grinning rather than looking nervous. This is incredible, she called over the engine noise. Calvin had forgotten how much he enjoyed sharing this. The pure joy of being on the water. The way the boat felt alive beneath them as they cut through the swells. He'd been taking it for granted, he realized. The freedom, the perspective, the sense of possibility that came with every trip beyond the harbor. He throttled back as they approached the point where the island curved toward the open ocean, wanting to give Vivian the full effect of seeing Palmar Island from this angle. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light, including the historic district they'd walked through yesterday, the marina they'd just left, and the inn where they were both staying. "Oh my," Vivian breathed, standing to get a better view. "It's like a postcard. Wait until sunset. Gets even better." Calvin cut the engine and let them drift, the sudden quiet broken only by the gentle slap of waves against the hull. "See that break in the tree-line? That's where the old pier used to extend. And over there," he pointed toward a section of beach. "That's where the first settlers landed in the 1600s. Vivian was quiet for a moment, taking it all in. "You can see the whole story from out here. How the island developed, why they built where they did." "Exactly. The high ground for the houses, protected harbor for the boats, fresh water from the creek." Calvin found himself relaxing as he talked, the way he always did when discussing something he understood completely. Everything made sense when you see it from this perspective. "It's beautiful." Vivian turned to look at him, and something in her expression made his chest tighten. "Thank you for sharing this with me. Just seemed like you'd appreciate it. Most tourists want to go fast, see how many dolphins they can spot. But you..." He trailed off, not sure how to finish the thought. "But I what?" Calvin busied himself checking the anchor, buying time to figure out what he'd been about to say. "You pay attention to things. The details that matter." They drifted in comfortable silence for a while, watching pelicans dive for fish and listening to the distant sound of gulls. Calvin couldn't remember the last time he'd been out here without a specific purpose. Fishing grounds to check, charters to run, or mechanical issues to diagnose. Just being on the water for the pleasure of it felt almost foreign. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian said eventually. Calvin nodded. "When you lost your house, did you ever think about leaving the island? Starting over somewhere else?" The question caught him off guard. He'd expected something about the boat, or fishing, or maybe the history he'd been sharing. "Not this. Every day for about 6 months," he said honestly. "Had a cousin in Jacksonville who said I could crash with him, help run his charter business. Clean slate, no reminders." "What stopped you?" Calvin looked toward the island, trying to put into words something he'd never really examined. "This place is in my blood, I guess. My grandfather fished these waters, my father grew up here. I know every sandbar, every current, every place the fish like to hide." He paused. Leaving would have felt like losing more than just a house. "So you stayed and rebuilt." "So I stayed and drifted." The admission came out more bitter than he'd intended. "Haven't exactly rebuilt anything." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Maybe rebuilding doesn't always mean putting everything back exactly the way it was." "What do you mean?" "I don't know. I'm still figuring that out myself." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and Calvin found himself watching the simple gesture with more attention than it warranted. "But sometimes I think we get so focused on recreating what we lost that we miss what we might gain." Calvin considered this as the boat rocked gently in the swells. What might he gain? He'd been so focused on what Hurricane Isabel had taken, his house, his sense of permanence, his belief that anything good could last, that he'd never considered what might be possible instead. The sun was getting lower now, painting the water in shades of gold and orange that shifted with every wave. Vivian had moved to the bow, one hand on the rail as she watched the colors change across the sky. "This is when it gets really good," Calvin said, moving to stand beside her. As if on cue, the sun touched the horizon, and the entire western sky exploded in color. Vivian gasped, and Calvin felt a surge of pride, as if he'd personally arranged the display for her benefit. "I've never seen anything like this," she said softly. "Every sunset's different out here. Clouds, humidity, time of year, they all change how the light looks." Calvin found himself standing closer to her than he'd intended, close enough to smell her faint perfume over the salt air. "But this one's pretty special." Vivian turned to look at him, and something in her expression made his breath catch. Her face was soft in the golden light, unguarded in a way he'd never seen before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then a swell larger than the others rocked the boat, and Vivian reached out to steady herself. Her hand landed on his arm, and Calvin felt the contact like an electric shock. Instead of pulling away, she left her hand there, her fingers warm through the fabric of his shirt. "Calvin," she said, and his name sounded different in her voice. Softer, more personal. "Yes? I'm glad you stayed. On the island, I mean." Her cheeks flushed slightly. "I can't imagine this place without you." The words hit him harder than they should have. When was the last time someone had said they were glad he was somewhere? That his presence mattered? "Vivian," he started, but found himself at a loss for words. She was looking at him with those steel blue eyes, waiting for him to say something meaningful, and all he could think about was how the sunset light was turning her hair to copper and how wrong he'd been about everything. About her being too fancy for island life. About her not understanding what really mattered. About himself not deserving something good. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "What?" "I think you look like you belong here." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, weighted with more truth than he'd meant to reveal. "More than any place I've ever seen you." Vivian went very still, her hand still resting on his arm. For a long moment, she just looked at him, and Calvin wondered if he'd said too much, revealed more than she wanted to hear. Then her lips parted slightly, as if she was going to say something, but no words came. She just stood there, speechless, while the sunset painted everything around them in impossible colors. Calvin felt something shift between them, some fundamental change in the way they were looking at each other. This wasn't the gruff fisherman and the fancy decorator anymore. This was something else entirely, something that made his chest tight and his hands unsteady. The boat rocked again, and this time when Vivian steadied herself, her other hand came up to rest against his chest. Calvin's heart hammered against his ribs, and he was pretty sure she could feel it. "Calvin," she whispered, and there was something in her voice he'd never heard before. Something that made him want to do things he'd convinced himself he was too old and too set in his ways for. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They should head back soon. The boat had lights, but navigating the harbor in full darkness was trickier than it needed to be. But Calvin didn't want this moment to end. Didn't want to go back to being careful and guarded and convinced that good things didn't last. For the first time in 2 years, he wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, something beautiful might be beginning instead of ending. "Vivian," he said softly. She looked up at him, her lips slightly parted, and something in her expression made his heart hammer against his ribs. In the starlight, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her guard completely down, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Calvin," she whispered, and there was something in her voice he'd never heard before. Something that made him want to do things he'd convinced himself he was too old and too set in his ways for. He reached up and touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for just a moment. "I shouldn't," he started. "You should," she said, opening her eyes to meet his. "We should." And then somehow the distance between them disappeared. Calvin wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly Vivian was in his arms and he was kissing her like she was air and he'd been drowning. She tasted like salt and possibility, and when her arms came up around his neck, Calvin felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This wasn't the careful, tentative beginning he'd expected. This was urgent and real and absolutely terrifying in the best possible way. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Calvin rested his forehead against hers. "That was..." he started. "Yeah," she said softly. "It really was." They stood there as the sky darkened around them, her hands still touching him, both of them balanced on the edge of something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "We should probably head back," he said finally, though he made no move to step away from her. "Probably," Vivian agreed, but she didn't move either. Finally, Calvin forced himself to step back and return to the helm. As he started the engine and turned the boat toward harbor, he caught Vivian watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between wonder and uncertainty. As they made their way back through the darkness, the lights of Palmar Island growing larger ahead of them, Calvin couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Chapter 7. Vivian sat on the edge of her bed at the inn, her hair still loose from the ocean breeze. The evening on Calvin's boat felt both immediate and dreamlike, as if she couldn't quite believe it had happened. "You look like you belong here more than any place I've ever seen." Calvin's words kept echoing in her mind, spoken in that rough voice that somehow managed to be both matter-of-fact and deeply personal. The way he'd looked at her in the sunset light, like he was seeing something in her that she'd never seen in herself, had left her feeling exposed and exhilarated in equal measure. When was the last time someone had looked at her like that? Not as Vivian Shaw, the successful interior designer with the polished reputation and the carefully curated aesthetic. Just as herself, windblown and makeup-free and completely unprepared for the intensity of the moment. She'd been speechless, literally unable to form words in response to his unexpected declaration. And Calvin, bless him, hadn't pushed for a response. He'd simply given her space to process, the way he seemed to understand she needed. Now, alone in her room with the practical world creeping back in, Vivian found herself questioning everything. Did she belong here? Really? Or was this just another beautifully designed fantasy, the kind of escape that looked perfect from the outside but couldn't survive contact with real life? Her laptop chimed with an incoming email, and Vivian glanced at the screen out of habit. Then she froze. The sender was her former business partner, the woman who'd bought out her share of Shaw and Associates design and promptly rebranded it under her own name. They hadn't spoken since the final paperwork had been signed 3 months ago. Vivian stared at the subject line, Opportunity, Peninsula Luxury Development. She should delete it. Should close the laptop and go take that shower, maybe order room service and spend the evening sketching the sunset she'd just witnessed from Calvin's boat. But her finger was already clicking on the email before her rational mind could intervene. Vivian. I hope this finds you well. I know we left things on difficult terms, but I'm reaching out because an opportunity has come up that I think would be perfect for your particular expertise. My firm has been selected to handle the interior design for Peninsula Luxury Development, a $50 million waterfront project outside Hilton Head. High-end vacation homes and a boutique resort, all with historic coastal charm. The developer specifically requested someone with authentic preservation experience, and frankly, you're the best in the Southeast. This would be a 2-year project with a substantial fee. Enough to set up your own firm again if that's what you wanted. The lead developer, Mark Webb, has already approved your involvement based on your portfolio. We'd be collaborating as independent consultants, each handling different aspects of the design. I know you felt that our vision for the company had diverged, but this project would let you work the way you've always preferred, authentic materials, period-appropriate details, that meticulous research you're known for. It's exactly the kind of work you love. Please consider it. The initial meeting is next week in Hilton Head, and they need an answer by Friday. Best regards, Amanda. Vivian read the email twice, then set the laptop aside and walked to the window. Outside, the inn's gardens were bathed in moonlight, peaceful and timeless. Somewhere beyond the trees, she could hear the gentle sound of waves against the shore. $50 million. A 2-year project. The chance to build something significant again, to prove that her approach to design still had value in the modern marketplace. She thought about her savings account, which was healthy but not infinite. About her empty apartment in Atlanta, where she'd been living like a guest since before the buyout. About the growing pile of emails from colleagues and potential clients that she'd been ignoring, assuming she needed time to figure out what came next. Maybe what came next had just found her. But even as she tried to feel excited about the opportunity, something felt wrong. The email was perfectly professional, but underneath the polite language, Vivian could hear the same attitude that had driven their partnership apart. Historic coastal charm in quotes, as if it were just a marketing phrase rather than something worth preserving. The assumption that she'd jump at the chance to work the way she'd always preferred, as if her principles were just personal quirks rather than professional standards. And Mark Webb? She knew that name. A developer known for creating luxury experiences that borrowed superficial elements from local history while ignoring everything that actually made a place special. The kind of man who would build a resort that looked vaguely colonial from the outside while filling it with imported marble and calling it authentic. Vivian sat back down on the bed, her laptop still open to Amanda's email. This was what she'd been trained for, what she'd spent 25 years building expertise in. High-end projects with unlimited budgets and national recognition potential. The chance to influence how people lived and worked and experienced beautiful spaces. So why did it feel like a step backward? Her phone buzzed with a text from a friend in Atlanta. How's island life? Ready to come back to civilization yet? Vivian stared at the message, trying to summon her usual fondness for the gentle teasing. But the word civilization rankled in a way it never had before. As if what she'd found here, the quiet rhythms of island life, the way people knew each other's stories, the sunset from Calvin's boat, was somehow less real than conference rooms and client presentations. She thought about Calvin's calloused hands helping her into the boat, the way he'd shared his knowledge of the island's history not to impress her but simply because he loved the place. The way he'd looked at her like she might actually belong somewhere, not because she'd arranged herself to fit in but because something essential in her matched something essential in this place. But Calvin was dealing with his own uncertainty, his own resistance to believing good things could last. And she was, what? A woman in her late 50s who'd lost her professional identity and was maybe confusing a pretty sunset with a life-changing revelation? She opened her email and started typing a response. Thank you for thinking of me for this opportunity. It sounds like an impressive project. She paused, cursor blinking. What came next? I'm interested? I need more details? Count me in? Instead, she found herself writing, I'm currently in the middle of some personal projects, but I'd be happy to discuss the timeline and scope. Are you available for a call tomorrow morning? I could do 10 a.m. if that works. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was the response of someone keeping her options open, someone too practical to turn down a $50 million opportunity without at least exploring what it might mean. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The laptop chimed almost immediately with a reply, perfect. I'll conference in Marcus at 10 a.m. sharp. This is going to be amazing, V. Just like old times. Just like old times. The phrase sat heavy in Vivian's chest as she finally closed the laptop and headed for the shower. But which old times? The early days when she and her partner had shared a vision for bringing authentic beauty into modern spaces? Or the later years when every project became an exercise in compromise, when authentic gradually became authentic inspired and then historically themed? In the shower, as hot water washed away the salt air and boat diesel, Vivian tried to imagine herself in a conference room next week, presenting ideas to Mark Webb and his development team. Tried to picture herself explaining why hand-forged hardware mattered, why locally sourced materials were worth the extra cost, why getting the historical details right wasn't just about aesthetics but about honoring the stories of the people who'd lived and worked in these places. She could do it. She'd done it hundreds of times before, fought those battles and won more often than she'd lost. She was good at her job, maybe even great at it when she was working with clients who shared her values. But as she toweled off and caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror, sun-touched skin, hair still bearing the imprint of ocean wind, she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Amanda's offer would mean giving up something she was only just beginning to understand. Vivian put on her pajamas and climbed into bed, but sleep felt impossible. Through the window, she could see a few lights still on at the marina. One of them might be Calvin's boat, where he was probably checking on supplies and planning tomorrow's charter, comfortable in his knowledge of tides and wind patterns and the secret places where fish liked to hide. He'd told her she looked like she belonged here. But did belonging somewhere mean staying, or did it mean having the confidence to carry that sense of home with you wherever you went? And if she took the Peninsula project, would she be choosing her career over, what, exactly? A man she'd known for a week? A place she'd been visiting for not much longer? A feeling that might be nothing more than vacation-induced nostalgia? Or would she be choosing the safe path over the possibility of something real? Vivian stared at the ceiling until well past midnight, but she was no closer to answers when she finally drifted off to sleep. And her dreams were filled with conference rooms that slowly transformed into sunset-painted waters, where she stood at the helm of a boat she didn't know how to navigate, searching for a shoreline that kept shifting just beyond her reach. Chapter 8. Calvin was coming back from checking on the Miss Behaven when he decided to grab a cup of coffee from the inn's kitchen. As he approached the back porch, he heard Vivian's voice through the open French doors. She was pacing near the windows, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a tone that was crisp and professional in a way he'd never heard before. He should have announced himself, or turned around and come back later. Instead, he found himself frozen just outside the doorway, her words hitting him like physical blows. "I understand the timeline is aggressive," she was saying, her tone crisp and professional in a way he'd never heard before. "But if we're talking about a 2-year commitment, I need to know exactly what kind of creative control I'd have." Calvin's hand stilled on the fuel line. 2-year commitment? Creative control? This didn't sound like someone planning to extend her stay at the Pelican Inn. "The initial meeting next week works for me," Vivian continued. "Hilton Head is only about 3 hours from here, so I can drive up for the day." "Yes, I understand the scope of the project. 50 million is certainly significant." 50 million. Calvin felt something cold settle in his stomach. Whatever Vivian was discussing, it was big. Professional. The kind of opportunity that people like her, successful, talented, with options, didn't turn down. He'd been a fool to think yesterday's sunset meant anything more than a nice evening for her. A pleasant distraction while she figured out her real next move. "I'll need to see the preliminary plans before I commit to anything," Vivian was saying. "But yes, it sounds like exactly the kind of project I've been looking for." Exactly the kind of project she'd been looking for. While he'd been showing her around and telling her she belonged here, she'd been fielding offers for her next career move. Planning her exit strategy from this little island interlude. Calvin returned to the boat and finished the fuel filter replacement with sharp, efficient movements, his jaw tight with a familiar anger. Not at Vivian. He had no right to be angry at her for having a life and career beyond Palmar Island. He was angry at himself for forgetting, even for a moment, that people like her didn't stay in places like this. He'd done this before. With Marlene, who'd spent their entire marriage looking for something better, somewhere else, someone with more ambition than a fisherman who was content to work the same waters his grandfather had fished. He'd thought he'd learned from that mistake, but apparently his capacity for self-deception was stronger than his memory. By the time Calvin made it to breakfast the next morning, he'd rebuilt every wall Vivian had somehow managed to breach. He poured his coffee and took his usual table by the window, pointedly not looking up when she entered the dining room. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm with what sounded like genuine pleasure at seeing him. "Morning," Calvin replied without looking up from his weather report. The National Weather Service was predicting a front moving through on Friday. Perfect excuse to cancel weekend charters if he needed space to think. Vivian hesitated in the doorway, and Calvin could feel her watching him. After a moment, she approached his table. "Mind if I join you?" Miss Doris made her famous blueberry pancakes, and eating alone seems like a waste of such good company. The casual intimacy in her tone, the assumption that they were now the kind of people who shared breakfast, who sought out each other's company, made Calvin's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to longing. "Free country," he said, still not looking at her. Vivian sat down across from him, and Calvin caught a whiff of her lavender perfume mixed with coffee. Yesterday, that combination had made him think about lazy mornings and shared routines. Today, it just reminded him of all the things he was apparently stupid enough to want but smart enough not to expect. "Everything all right?" Vivian asked. Calvin finally looked up, taking in her concerned expression, the way she was leaning slightly forward like she actually cared about his answer. She was good at this, he'd give her that. Making people feel like they mattered to her. "Just tired. Long day yesterday." "Oh." Her face fell. I mean, I had such a wonderful time on your boat. The sunset was incredible." "Glad you enjoyed it." Calvin returned his attention to the weather report, but the words blurred together. He couldn't concentrate on wind patterns when Vivian was sitting 3 feet away, radiating the kind of hurt bewilderment that made him want to explain himself. But what was he supposed to say? That he'd overheard her making plans to leave? That he'd been foolish enough to think one perfect evening might mean something more than a pleasant memory for her to take back to Atlanta? Calvin. Vivian's voice was quieter now, but there was steel underneath the softness. What's going on? Yesterday you told me I looked like I belonged here, and now you can barely look at me. The directness of it caught him off guard. In his experience, when women were upset with him, they expected him to figure out why. Vivian was apparently the type to skip the guessing games and ask straight questions. Nothing's going on. Reality setting in, I guess. What reality? Calvin set down his coffee cup harder than necessary. The reality that people like you don't stick around places like this. You've got a life to get back to, career opportunities waiting. Island time's nice for a vacation, but it's not real life. Vivian went very still. People like me? Successful. Ambitious. Used to having options. Calvin forced himself to meet her eyes, even though what he saw there made him want to take back every word. Not the type to stick around anyway. The hurt that crossed Vivian's face was swift and sharp, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. I see. And you've determined this how, exactly? Experience. The word came out more bitter than he'd intended. Look, yesterday was nice. Really nice. But let's not pretend it was more than it was. And what was it, Calvin? According to you? This was his chance to back down, to apologize for his behavior and try to salvage whatever had been building between them. But the defensive voice in his head, the one that sounded suspiciously like Marlene telling him he lacked ambition, was stronger than his better judgment. A pleasant way to pass the time while you figured out your next move. Vivian's coffee cup clinked against her saucer as she set it down with deliberate precision. My next move. The job offer. $50 million project, 2-year commitment. Sounds like exactly what someone with your talent should be doing. Calvin hated how reasonable he sounded, how he was managing to turn his own hurt into magnanimous support for her career advancement. Understanding dawned in Vivian's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like anger. You were listening to my phone call. Hard not to hear when you're on the phone right outside the dining room, Calvin said, aiming for casual and probably missing by miles. Congratulations, by the way. Sounds like a great opportunity. For a long moment, Vivian just looked at him. When she finally spoke, her voice was dangerously quiet. You're right about one thing, Calvin. Yesterday was nice. But apparently I was wrong about what I saw in you. She stood, smoothing her linen pants with hands that Calvin noticed weren't quite steady. I thought I saw someone brave enough to take a chance on something real. Turns out you're just someone who's more comfortable assuming the worst than risking being disappointed. Vivian. Don't. She held up a hand, and Calvin saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You've made your position clear. I'm just a distraction for you, someone passing time before moving on to bigger and better things. Well, congratulations on being right. I apparently am exactly that type of person. She walked away before Calvin could respond, leaving him alone with his coffee and the hollow satisfaction of having proven his own point. He'd been right about her having other plans, other priorities. The job offer was real, the opportunity everything he'd assumed it would be. So why did being right feel so much like losing everything that mattered? Miss Doris appeared at his table with a plate of blueberry pancakes he hadn't ordered, her expression carefully neutral. Rough morning? She asked. Calvin stared at the pancakes, his appetite gone. Something like that. You know, Calvin, there's a difference between protecting yourself and sabotaging yourself. Is there? Calvin pushed the plate away. Because from where I'm sitting, they look pretty much the same. Miss Doris studied him for a moment, then shook her head. That woman came down to breakfast this morning looking happier than I've seen her since she arrived. Glowing, even. Now she's gone upstairs looking like someone just broke her heart. She picked up the untouched pancakes. Funny how these things work out, isn't it? Just when something good starts to happen, someone always finds a reason it can't. She walked away, leaving Calvin alone with the devastating realization that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. And this time, he had no one to blame but himself. Chapter 9. Vivian threw her clothes into her suitcase with more force than necessary, each item landing with a satisfying thud that did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. She'd been such a fool. Letting herself believe that Calvin's kiss meant something, that the way he'd looked at her in the starlight was real and not just some momentary lapse in judgment he was already regretting. Not the type to stick around anyway. The words stung more because there was truth in them. She was leaving, wasn't she? Running back to Atlanta and a meeting with her former business partner, ready to dive into another project that would consume the next 2 years of her life. Maybe Calvin had simply seen her more clearly than she'd seen herself. A soft knock on her door made her pause, a silk blouse half folded in her hands. "Vivian, dear?" "It's Miss Doris." Vivian considered pretending she wasn't there, but Miss Doris had been nothing but kind to her since she'd arrived. She didn't deserve to be ignored just because Vivian was nursing wounded pride. "Come in," she called, not trusting her voice to sound entirely normal. Miss Doris entered carrying a tea service on a small tray, taking in the scene with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. The open suitcase, the scattered clothes, Vivian's probably tear-streaked face, it all told a story that didn't require explanation. "Thought you might like some chamomile," Miss Doris said, setting the tray on the bedside table with the casual efficiency of someone who'd been taking care of people for decades. "Good for settling nerves." "Thank you, but I'm fine. I need to get organized." Vivian resumed her packing with determinately brisk movements. "I've decided to cut my stay short. There's really no point in staying longer." "I see." Miss Doris settled into the room's single armchair uninvited, clearly planning to stay a while. "Sudden change of plans?" "Something like that." Vivian folded a blouse with unnecessary precision. "Plus I have a business opportunity that's come up. It could lead to something significant." "Oh? What kind of opportunity?" "A $50 million development project. Historic coastal properties, exactly the kind of work I've spent my career preparing for." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, like she was trying to convince herself as much as Miss Doris. "Sounds impressive," Miss Doris said mildly. "And that's why you're leaving early?" "Partly." Vivian couldn't quite meet her eyes. "It just seems like the right time to get back to my real life." "Of course." Miss Doris poured 2 cups of tea, the familiar ritual somehow soothing despite Vivian's agitation. "Though I have to say, you seemed quite happy yesterday evening. Positively glowing when you came back from your boat ride with Calvin." Vivian's hand stilled on a pair of linen pants. "Well, people can seem like a lot of things that turn out not to be true." "Indeed they can." Miss Doris's tone was carefully neutral. "Calvin can be particularly good at that. Seeming like something he's not." Despite herself, Vivian found herself curious. "What do you mean?" "Oh, he likes to pretend he's just a simple fisherman without much use for complicated emotions or fancy people. But I've known Calvin for a long time, and I can tell you he's got one of the biggest hearts and sharpest minds on this island." Miss Doris sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Also one of the most stubborn streaks when it comes to protecting himself." Vivian sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. "He made it very clear what he thinks of me. That I'm just passing time until something better comes along." "And is that what you're doing?" The question was asked so gently that Vivian felt tears prick at her eyes. "I don't know. Maybe. Probably." She gestured helplessly at her suitcase. "I mean, look at me. The first time things get difficult, I'm literally packing my bags." Miss Doris considered this. "You know, I've been watching Elise and Jacob restore it piece by piece." Beautiful work, but there were plenty of times when the whole project looked like a disaster. Walls coming down, pipes bursting, unexpected problems that made them question everything they were trying to build. Vivian wasn't sure where this was going, but something in Miss Doris's tone made her listen. The difference between a renovation that succeeds and one that fails, Miss Doris continued, isn't whether you encounter problems. It's whether you stick around to solve them. Building something real, whether it's a room or a relationship, requires staying through the messy parts. But what if the other person doesn't want you to stay? What if they've already decided you don't belong? What if they're just scared? Miss Doris met Vivian's eyes steadily. What if they've been hurt before and they're doing their best to get hurt again before someone else can do it to them? Vivian thought about Calvin's face when he'd talked about his destroyed house, the careful way he'd phrased his loss. The photograph she'd found and kept, worn from handling. A man who'd learned not to count on things lasting. That doesn't excuse treating people badly, she said, but with less conviction than before. No, it doesn't. But it might explain it. Miss Doris set down her teacup. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Vivian could answer, her phone buzzed with an email. Her former business partner, following up on their call with additional details about the Peninsula project timeline. The opportunity's real, she said, more to herself than to Miss Doris. They want an answer by Friday. And what do you want? Miss Doris asked gently. Vivian stared at the email, then set the phone aside. I don't know anymore. Well then. Miss Doris stood and smoothed her skirt. That's actually progress. Not knowing is the first step toward figuring out what you really want, instead of what you think you should want. She headed for the door, then paused. For what it's worth, dear, I think Calvin was right about one thing. You do look like you belong here. Question is, do you feel like you belong here? Miss Doris left, closing the door softly behind her. Vivian sat in the sudden quiet, surrounded by her half-packed belongings and the lingering scent of chamomile tea. The Peninsula project was real, the deadline approaching. She should finish packing, take some time to think, then drive back to Atlanta and make her decision. Take the job and spend the next 2 years creating beautiful spaces for wealthy people who would probably never appreciate the historical significance of what they were buying. Instead, she found herself reaching for her sketchbook, the one where she'd been working on design ideas since arriving at the inn. Maybe she could at least finish the sketches of the sunrise she'd witnessed from Calvin's boat, capture something of what these few days had meant before she left them behind. As she flipped through the pages, something fluttered to the floor. A small, worn photograph that she'd forgotten she'd tucked between the pages. The picture of Calvin's house that he'd dropped in the sunroom. Vivian picked it up, studying the image with new understanding. The simple building with its weathered shingles and modest front porch. The carefully tended garden, the porch swing hanging at just the right angle. Someone had loved this place, had made it into a home with patience and attention to detail. Calvin had carried this picture of his destroyed house, a reminder of everything Hurricane Isabel had taken from him. Not just the building, but the sense of having a place where he belonged, where someone might choose to stay. Vivian turned the photograph over in her hands, feeling the soft edges worn smooth by handling. She thought about Calvin's face when he'd told her she looked like she belonged here, the wonder in his voice like he couldn't quite believe what he was saying. And then this morning, the careful walls he'd rebuilt, the way he'd dismissed their kiss as if it had meant nothing at all. What if Miss Doris was right? What if Calvin wasn't rejecting her so much as protecting himself from the possibility of being rejected? Her phone buzzed again. More details about the project. Vivian looked at the photograph, then at her suitcase, then at the window where she could see a slice of the harbor where Calvin's boat was docked. She thought about staying through the messy parts, about building something real instead of running away the moment it got complicated. She thought about what it might mean to belong somewhere not because you'd arranged yourself to fit in, but because something essential in you matched something essential in the place itself. And slowly, carefully, Vivian began unpacking her suitcase. Chapter 10. Calvin spent the rest of the morning avoiding the inn. He checked and rechecked the Miss Behaven's engine, organized his tackle box twice, and cleaned parts of the boat that didn't need cleaning. Anything to keep from going back inside and facing what he'd done. But by noon, the guilt was eating him alive. He'd replayed the breakfast conversation a dozen times, hearing his own voice getting colder with each word. Seeing the hurt in Vivian's eyes when he'd dismissed their kiss, their evening together, as nothing more than her passing time until something better came along. The worst part was that he'd known he was being unfair even as the words left his mouth. Vivian hadn't done anything wrong. She'd received a job offer. Of course she had. She was talented and successful and exactly the kind of person who got offered $50 million projects. That didn't mean she'd been using him, or that their time together hadn't meant anything. But fear had made him cruel, and now it was probably too late to take any of it back. Calvin climbed the path from the marina to the inn, steeling himself for what he might find. Vivian's rental car was still in the parking area, which gave him a brief moment of hope before he remembered that she'd probably needed time to pack and check out. The sunroom was empty. Of course it was. Calvin stood in the doorway, looking at the space where they'd argued over thermostats and throw pillows just a few days ago. Where she'd shown him her sketches and he'd been surprised by her genuine interest in his work. The room felt hollow without her presence, and he realized with uncomfortable clarity that the entire inn was going to feel that way once she left. If she hadn't already. He walked through the first floor, checking rooms he had no business checking, looking for some sign that she might still be there. The dining room was empty except for Miss Doris clearing lunch dishes. She looked up when he appeared, her expression carefully neutral. Looking for someone? Is she? Calvin cleared his throat. Did Vivian check out? Not yet. Miss Doris's tone gave nothing away. Though I believe she's considering it. Calvin felt something loosen in his chest. Not yet. That meant there might still be time to fix this, if he could figure out how. Miss D, I think I made a mistake. I think you made several, she said crisply, stacking plates with more force than necessary. The question is, what are you planning to do about it? Calvin ran a hand through his hair. I don't know. Apologize, I guess. If she'll listen to me. She might. Vivian strikes me as the forgiving type when the apology's genuine. Miss Doris fixed him with a look that could have stripped paint. If you're going to do this, you need to be sure. That woman's already been hurt enough for one day. The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd hurt Vivian. Sweet, thoughtful Vivian who'd treated his old fishing guide like a treasure, who'd listened to his stories about the island's history like they mattered, who'd kissed him back with a passion that still made his chest tight to remember. I'm sure, he said quietly. I just don't know if it's too late. Miss Doris studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. She's in her room, last I checked. But Calvin? Think about what you're going to say before you knock on that door. Pretty words won't fix this if you're not ready to mean them. Calvin left the inn and walked down to the dock, his mind churning. What could he possibly say that would undo the damage he'd done? How did you apologize for accusing someone of using you when they'd done nothing but show you kindness? He sat on the edge of the dock, staring out at the water where he'd taken Vivian just 2 nights ago. The afternoon sun was warm on his shoulders, and pelicans dove for fish in the distance, following patterns as old as the island itself. This was where they'd started that perfect evening. Where he'd told her she looked like she belonged here, where she'd kissed him back like she meant it. Where for a few perfect hours, he'd allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved something good. And he'd thrown it all away because he was too scared to believe it could last. The truth hit him with the force of a rogue wave. This wasn't really about Vivian having other options. This was about him, about the walls he'd built after Hurricane Isabel had taken everything that mattered to him. The storm hadn't just destroyed his house. It had convinced him that caring about anything was a luxury he couldn't afford. For 2 years, he'd lived like a man just passing through. Temporary rentals, no commitments, nothing that couldn't be easily replaced if disaster struck again. He'd told himself it was practical, realistic. Really, it was just another form of running away. Vivian had seen through all of that. She'd looked at him and somehow seen someone worth staying for, someone worth taking a chance on. And instead of being grateful for the gift of her attention, he'd panicked and pushed her away. Calvin stood, his mind finally clear about what he needed to do. Apologize, yes. But more than that, he needed to show Vivian that he was ready to stop running, ready to build something real instead of protecting himself from the possibility of loss. He walked up the path toward the inn, steeling himself for what he might find. Vivian's rental car was still in the parking area, which gave him a surge of hope. As he approached the front entrance, Calvin noticed something different about the porch. Someone had rearranged the wicker furniture slightly, creating a more inviting conversation area. A few pieces of driftwood had been artfully placed along the railing, and the throw pillows were positioned with the kind of attention to detail that made everything look effortlessly better. The changes were subtle, almost unconscious. The kind of improvements Vivian couldn't help making wherever she went. Calvin's heart hammered against his ribs. She was still here. He found her in the sunroom, sitting on the settee with her sketchbook open in her lap, pencil moving across the page in careful strokes. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Hello, Calvin. The porch looks nice," he said, because it seemed like the safest place to start. "Thank you. I can't seem to help myself." A small, self-deprecating smile crossed her face. Old habits. They looked at each other across the room, and Calvin felt the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Her suitcase was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't necessarily mean she'd decided to stay. "Vivian, Calvin." She closed her sketchbook carefully, her fingers lingering on the cover. "Can we talk? Really talk this time?" Calvin's heart hammered against his ribs. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to make things right. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'd like that." Chapter 11. Vivian closed her sketchbook as Calvin settled into the chair across from her, his expression cautious but hopeful. The afternoon light streaming through the sunroom windows caught the gray in his hair, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested carefully on his knees like he was afraid to take up too much space. "I owe you an apology," he started, but Vivian held up a hand. "Actually, I think I owe you one too." She smoothed her fingers over the sketchbook's cover, gathering her courage. "This morning, when you said I wasn't the type to stick around, part of me was already proving you right. I was packing, Calvin. Ready to run back to Atlanta and pretend none of this had happened." Calvin's face tightened with what looked like pain. "Vivian. Let me finish." She took a breath, meeting his eyes. "You were scared, and you lashed out. I was scared, and I was ready to run. Neither of us was being particularly brave. What changed your mind?" Vivian opened her sketchbook, flipping past pages of design ideas and architectural details until she found what she was looking for. This did. She turned the book around so Calvin could see the sketch she'd been working on. It showed a small coastal cottage with weathered shingles and a modest front porch, but this wasn't the destroyed house from his photograph. This was the house reimagined. Restored with careful attention to its original character but enhanced with thoughtful improvements. "My house," Calvin said quietly, his voice rough with surprise. "Your house as it could be." Vivian traced one of the lines with her finger. "I found your photograph a few days ago. You dropped it in here. I kept meaning to give it back, but then I started thinking about what it would look like restored. Not just rebuilt, but thoughtfully brought back to life." "The foundation structure is good," Vivian said, her professional instincts taking over. "I researched the building techniques from that era. With the right contractor, you could restore the original character while improving on what you had before. Better storm-resistant features, more efficient systems, but all done in ways that honor the original design." "You researched building techniques?" Calvin's tone was wondering, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "I spent 3 hours yesterday in the island's Historical Society archives." Vivian felt heat creep up her neck. "I told myself it was just professional curiosity, but really." I wanted to understand what you'd lost. What mattered to you? Calvin was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over every detail of her sketch. This is incredible work, Vivian. But why? Why spend time on something that doesn't exist anymore? This was the moment she'd been building toward, the conversation that would determine everything that came next. Vivian closed the sketchbook and set it aside, giving Calvin her full attention. Because I realized something while I was drawing it. I've spent my entire career decorating other people's dreams. Creating beautiful spaces for clients who would live in them for a few years before selling and moving on to the next beautiful space. I was very good at it, but I was always just visiting. Making things lovely for other people while never really belonging anywhere myself. Calvin's expression was intent, focused on her words in a way that made her feel truly heard. The Peninsula project my former business partner offered me? It's exactly that. $50 million worth of beautiful spaces for wealthy people who see historic coastal charm as a lifestyle brand rather than something real and rooted. Vivian gestured toward the window, where the afternoon light was painting everything in golden hues. But this place, being here with you, it's the first time I've wanted to stop decorating the world and start building something real. What are you saying? Vivian reached across the space between them and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. I'm saying I called my former business partner this afternoon and turned down the Peninsula project. Calvin's eyes widened. Vivian, that was a huge opportunity. It was the wrong opportunity. She squeezed his hand gently. I don't want to create more beautiful spaces for people who'll never appreciate them. I want to find beauty right here. Make this place my home and see where that takes me. Takes us. If you're interested in finding out too. For a moment, Calvin just stared at her, and Vivian felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd laid everything on the line. Her feelings, her plans, her vision of a future she'd never dared to imagine before this week. You turned down $50 million, he said finally. I turned down a project worth $50 million, she corrected. There's a difference. To stay here. To make Palmar Island my home and see what happens when I stop running from good things. Vivian felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with emotional territory. That is, if you're interested in seeing what happens too. Calvin was quiet for so long that Vivian began to worry she'd misread everything. Maybe the kiss on his boat had been an anomaly, a moment of impulse he was already regretting. I've been drifting for 2 years, Calvin said. Ever since Hurricane Isabel took my house. Told myself I was being practical, staying flexible in case another storm hit. Really, I was just scared to care about anything enough to lose it again. He turned his hand palm up, threading his fingers through hers. But looking at this sketch, listening to you talk about making this place your home, I realize I don't want to drift anymore. I want to rebuild that house. Not exactly the way it was, but the way it could be. And I want to see what happens when 2 people decide to stop being scared of good things. Calvin. His name came out soft, almost wondering. I'm tired of being scared, Vivian. Tired of protecting myself from loss by never really having anything worth caring about. Calvin lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I want to rebuild my house, make this island my real home again. And I want to see what happens between us when we're both brave enough to try. Vivian felt tears prick at her eyes. Happy tears, overwhelmed tears, tears that came from a place of pure relief. Are you sure? Because I have to warn you, I'm probably going to have opinions about your decorating choices. Calvin's laugh was warm and genuine, transforming his entire face. I'm counting on it. That house is going to need someone with your eye for beauty, your attention to detail. Your way of making spaces feel like they're actually meant for living in. And I'm going to need someone who knows how to read tide charts and fix boat engines and tell stories about the island's history, Vivian said, her own smile growing. Someone who understands that the best things are worth waiting for, worth working for. Is that what we're doing? Working for something? Vivian looked at him, this man who'd somehow seen past her polished surface to something real underneath, who'd shared his knowledge and his boat and his carefully guarded heart, and felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones. "I think we're both choosing to stay and see what happens," she said. "To stop running from good things and start building something real. Maybe not together right away, but in the same place. Seeing where it leads." Calvin stood and pulled her to her feet, and when he kissed her this time, it felt like a promise. Not just of passion, but of partnership. Of two people who'd spent years feeling displaced finally finding their way home. When they broke apart, Vivian rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing hard. "So," she said softly. "When do we start?" Calvin's smile was brighter than any sunset she'd ever seen. "How about right now?" And as the afternoon light streamed through the windows of the sunroom where they'd first argued over thermostats and throw pillows, Vivian Shaw finally understood the difference between decorating a space and creating a home. It wasn't about the perfect arrangement of furniture or the right color palette or even the most beautiful architectural details. It was about finding someone who saw you clearly, who appreciated the way you moved through the world, who wanted to build something lasting together. It was about choosing to stay through the messy parts, to work through the complications, to believe that love, real, deep, transformative love, was worth the risk of loss. And it was about two people who'd spent years feeling like they didn't quite belong anywhere finally discovering that home wasn't a place at all. It was a choice. A daily decision to show up, to care, to build something beautiful together, one careful, intentional piece at a time. Epilogue. Palmar Island, 9 months later. Calvin adjusted his tie for the third time as he walked up the familiar oyster shell path to the Pelican Inn. The late October evening was crisp with the promise of cooler weather, and warm light spilled from every window of the beautifully restored building. "You're fidgeting," Vivian said, catching his hand in hers. Her wedding ring, a simple antique gold band that had fit her finger perfectly, caught the porch lights as she squeezed his fingers. "It's just dinner with friends." "I know." Calvin looked down at his wife of 3 months and felt the same jolt of wonder he'd experienced every day since their small ceremony on the beach behind his rebuilt house. "Still getting used to all of this." "All of what?" "Being this happy," he said simply. Vivian's smile was soft and radiant, the kind that had been making his heart skip beats for nearly a year now. "Well, you better get used to it, because I'm not going anywhere." Before Calvin could respond, the front door opened and Elise appeared, her face bright with welcome. "There you are. We were starting to think you'd gotten lost." She pulled Vivian into a warm hug, then turned to Calvin. "Though I suppose you two have been a little distracted lately, what with the wedding and the house and Vivian's new business taking off." Speaking of which, Jacob appeared behind his wife, carrying a bottle of champagne. "Congratulations on landing the Beaufort Historical Society project." Word as they specifically requested Shaw Historical Design. Vivian's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "It's still surreal, having clients seek me out instead of the other way around. Turns out there's quite a demand for authentic historical restoration work when you're willing to do the research properly." Calvin felt a familiar surge of pride. Vivian's consulting studio had grown beyond her wildest expectations, with preservation societies and historical homes throughout the Lowcountry seeking her expertise. She worked from a small office above the island's bookstore, with a clear view of the harbor where Calvin's boat bobbed at the new dock he'd built. "And how's the house coming along?" Elise asked as they made their way to the back porch, where Miss Doris was already setting up what appeared to be a marshmallow roasting station over a small fire pit. "The dock and boathouse are finally finished," Calvin said. Vivian insisted on historically accurate hardware, which meant special ordering everything from a craftsman in Charleston. "But it's solid enough to survive the next hurricane." "Which hopefully won't be for many years," Vivian added quickly, the way she always did when storms were mentioned. Calvin understood. They'd both learned to appreciate what they had without taking its permanence for granted. The house itself had been everything Vivian's sketches had promised and more. Working with a contractor who understood historical preservation, they'd rebuilt Calvin's cottage with careful attention to period details while incorporating modern conveniences and storm-resistant features. The result was a home that felt both timeless and perfectly suited to their life together. Calvin did most of the finish work himself, Vivian said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs Miss Doris had arranged around the fire pit. Turns out someone who can restore a boat engine can also restore original window hardware. And someone who can design beautiful spaces, Calvin said, taking the chair beside her, can make a simple cottage feel like the most welcoming place on earth. Miss Doris approached with a tray of marshmallows, graham crackers, and chocolate. S'mores seemed appropriate for a celebration. And before anyone asks, yes, I made the graham crackers from scratch. Of course you did, Jacob laughed, accepting a roasting fork. Is there anything you can't make from scratch? A sensible man out of Calvin took long enough, Miss Doris said with a pointed look at the groom in question. Though I'll admit, the end result was worth waiting for. As they settled into the comfortable rhythm of roasting marshmallows and catching up on island news, Calvin found himself observing the scene with a kind of amazed gratitude. 9 months ago, he'd been a man adrift, living in temporary spaces and convinced that caring about anything was too risky. Now he was surrounded by friends who felt like family, married to a woman who saw beauty in everything including him, and living in a home they'd built together with their own hands and hearts. Earth to Calvin, Vivian said, nudging his shoulder gently. You're doing that thing again. What thing? Looking like you can't quite believe this is real. Calvin glanced around the circle, Elise and Jacob sharing a perfectly toasted marshmallow, Miss Doris efficiently managing everyone's s'mores assembly, Vivian watching him with eyes that held all the warmth and understanding he'd never thought he deserved. Maybe because I can't, he admitted. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be married to an interior designer who rearranges my furniture when she thinks I'm not looking. I do not rearrange your furniture, Vivian protested. I optimize the flow of the space. Yesterday you moved the coffee table 3 inches to the left. The morning light was hitting it wrong. See? Calvin grinned at the group. This is what I married. A woman with excellent spatial awareness? Miss Doris suggested innocently. A woman who cares enough about our home to notice when the morning light hits the coffee table wrong, Calvin corrected, his voice growing softer. A woman who sees potential in broken-down fishermen and run-down houses and makes both of them better than they ever imagined they could be. Vivian's eyes grew suspiciously bright. Calvin. A woman, he continued, reaching for her hand, who taught me the difference between a house and a home. Who showed me that home isn't a place you find. It's something you build, one careful decision at a time, with someone who sees the world the way you do. Well, Elise said, dabbing at her own eyes, that's the most romantic thing I've heard all week. All month, Jacob corrected. All year, Miss Doris added decisively. And I've heard plenty of romantic nonsense working at an inn. As the evening wound down and they prepared to head back to their cottage, Calvin stood on the inn's porch looking out over the island that had become truly home. The harbor lights twinkled in the distance, and somewhere a night bird called across the water. Vivian was saying goodbye to Miss Doris, accepting a container of leftover s'mores and a batch of blueberry muffins. For breakfast, dear, the older woman said. Because I know neither of you remembers to eat properly when you're working. Calvin watched his wife laugh at something Elise said, her head thrown back in genuine delight, and felt something settle into place in his chest. This was what home felt like. Not just the physical space they'd created together, but this, the warmth of friendship, the comfort of belonging, the deep satisfaction of being known and loved exactly as you were. Ready? Vivian appeared at his side, threading her arm through his. More than ready. Calvin looked down at her, still amazed that she'd chosen to build a life here with him. Race you to the dock? In these shoes? I don't think so. But she was smiling as they made their way down the path, and when they reached their cottage, their home, she paused at the front door. What is it? Just looking, she said softly. Sometimes I still can't believe we actually built this. Calvin followed her gaze, taking in the restored cottage with its carefully chosen details and welcoming front porch. Through the windows, he could see the warm glow of the lamps Vivian had chosen, the furniture they'd selected together, the bookshelves lined with his fishing guides and her design volumes side by side. "We did," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "We really did." As they stood there in the moonlight, Calvin realized that the photograph he'd carried for 2 years, the image of his lost house, was still tucked away in a drawer somewhere. But he no longer needed it to remember what home looked like. Home looked like Vivian rearranging throw pillows and arguing with him about optimal furniture placement. Home looked like morning coffee shared on the dock while they watched the sunrise paint the water in impossible colors. Home looked like two people who'd spent years feeling displaced finally finding exactly where they belonged. It looked like love made visible in every carefully chosen detail, every shared laugh, every quiet moment of understanding. It looked like this. The end. This has been Finding Home at the Pelican Inn. Written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2025 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2025 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.